And they bring you in. They kind of parade you guys around, and you hear cameras clicking, and eventually you get put into New Guy Village, and you get put into, basically a torture room. So here you go back to the book. Several torture cells in the prison. The Green Nobby Room, so called because the walls and ceiling were covered with gobs of plaster the size of golf balls, which looked somewhat like mud dauber nests. The globs had a particular function, acoustics, to muffle human sound. Now you get through this day, sunset. I had difficulty in seeing what was beyond my cell, so I began reminiscing about the world of active life I had loved so much. Outside, my every minute had been filled. Outside, I had been king of the skies. Outside, I had been continually learning, doing, accomplishing. I had been proud, so very proud. And now I was tired, so perplexed, so confined, so very lonely. The trauma of overwhelming change caused my mind to reel with disorientation. I was afraid. I stared at the emptiness. Shadows crept up the walls, gradually becoming more pronounced. Curiously, a vague ghost-like impression materialized. The image took the appearance of the master with arms outstretched, a symbol. It was strange, yet something I felt I should expect. I began to utter the first lines of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. I repeated it aloud several times, not because of any deep religious drive, but because it simply seemed the thing to do. And then I prayed. I considered making a deal with God, but rejected the idea. I made no big promises and asked for no miracles, just strength. Strength to endure the hardship and strength for my wife, Anne. It would be difficult for her too. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that was certainly where I was.
An interesting point here is that in Colonel Reeder's podcast, you found the same thing, that he went to the 23rd Psalm. And again, it was just almost like, well, this is what I should do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I say there's no atheists in foxholes, mm-hmm. and I guess there aren't any in the prison camp. Although you do talk about some atheists in the prison camp.
I do, as a matter of fact. A couple of guys consider themselves atheists, and
yeah. And you also talk about faith, and one of the things that we'll get to this, but when you talk about faith, you talk about faith not just in God, but faith in your country, and the one that I think that regardless of what someone's religious beliefs are, faith in yourself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I think all three of those, or whichever one of those faiths where you find strength in mm-hmm. a time like this, lean on it.
Absolutely. And faith in the team as well. And we had to have faith in each other. And that was awfully important to be a part of a group like that could trust one another.
How quickly did you realize that you were part of, I guess we'll get to it, but I mean, when you first you're in this room, did you feel completely isolated at first and there's no one else here?
No, I knew that there were other prisoners there. I could hear them. Some of them were being tortured as I was. I could hear the torture. I could, I could peek out sometimes and see them walking by my cell. So I knew there were other prisoners in the area, and they just wouldn't let me talk to them.
So the interrogation begins. The torture begins. We're going back to the book. We read copy regulations. You obey. You live. No trouble. Okay? I did not respond. First regulation, you answer all question. The way that the North Vietnamese justified torture was peculiar. When they asked me questions and wanted military answers, I was not tortured to answer questions, but punished for disobeying camp regulations. What airplane you fly? I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Lamb, and they were calling you Lamb. What airplane? To answer this question was, of course, not in my rules. I'm sorry, I can't answer that. The officer again reminded me about the punishment for disobeying camp rules. Okay, you talk me or you talk steel. To which you responded, bring it on. The two higher ranking officials left. The remaining officer, with one word, ordered the guards forward. They brought it on. The steel mentioned by the interrogator consisted of iron manacles, shackles, and a leg bar. The shackles were cylindrical iron bars shaped like horseshoes but rounded at the end so that the 5-foot leg bar could be slipped into them and locked. The prisoner's ankles could then be forced through the openings and secured by the bar. The junior officer walked out. Guards blindfolded me, forced my wrists behind my back, and placed the open jaws of the manacles around them. These had obviously been intended for the more modest Vietnamese arms. They were so small that they had to be forced together just so the screw could be seated in the bottom of the threads. With what looked like a roller skate key, a guard began to turn the screw. My skin was pinched between the metal and quickly succumbed to the vise. I screamed in agony. Surely the guards wouldn't get these things much tighter. Blood oozed down my hands, and still the guard kept turning the key. Like powerful magnets, the iron was finally set flush. Circulation stopped. My hands burned grayish blue, tingled, and became numb. A guard then wrapped the rope first around my left elbow and then around my right and drew my elbows together behind my back. My shoulder muscles writhed, and I feared that my sternum would separate. I gasped for air. Then I was thrown abruptly to the floor. Shackles were jammed around my ankles, and the leg bar was fastened and padlocked. Electric wire, similar to the kind that I had hidden underneath the table, was brought forward. I thought that the guards were going to use this to shock me, but typical of the Vietnamese, they didn't have anything else to use for rope, and had torn the wire down from some light fixtures. This became the apparatus to wrap me up. It was first tied to the manacles, then thrown over my shoulder, and at last secured to the shackles around my ankles. Guards forced a bamboo pole under the wire and started rotating it so that the wire contracted, bringing my wrists up high on my back and drawing my face completely to my ankles. I was a human pretzel, a teacup with arms for a handle and the rest of my distorted body for the bowl. Circulation was impaired throughout my limbs, making them extremely painful to the touch. The guards, apparently drugged, exhibited wide and glassy eyes. They maliciously kicked me in the sides, the limbs, the back, and the head, giggling and having a great time. They picked me up a few feet from the floor and dropped me. Since I was on my side most of the time, they especially enjoyed standing on my head, symbolically victorious. The rubber tire sandals tore at my ear. My face, a ready target for abuse, was repeatedly subjected to fisticuffs and kicks. I remember staring at the floor and seeing my tears drop into pools of blood coming from my nose. The louder I screamed, the more they flailed. After about an hour, the junior officer returned. "You talk now?" "Yes." The guards loosened the wires and ropes. Blood rushed back into my veins with knifing pain. what airplane you fly. I hesitated a moment at the thought, well, they know the airplane I'm flying, and it's so ridiculous to undergo such torture for information they already have. The F-4B. That part right there, I mean, where you hesitate for a moment, and then you say to yourself, okay, these guys shot me down in an F4, which crashed into this paddy, and they know exactly what I was flying. This does not make sense for me to get this kind of abuse and torture for something that they already know. And when you came to that conclusion, did you was it pretty, were you feeling comfortable with it in your mind when you came to the conclusion, look, this is stupid?
No, I was really never comfortable at all in that. I felt very guilty. I was very remorseful that I had not been as strong as I wanted to be. And through the first several months of that experience, I felt like I felt very guilty about having given up. Fighter pilots are not supposed to give up. And the code of conduct, of course, name, rank, serial number, date of birth. I flew over the enemy thinking that I was strong enough and I was good enough, and suddenly I was thrust into this situation. And I even wondered, would I ever be able to go back to my country? Can I face my fellow fighter pilots that were stronger, and tougher? And I found out that feeling was across the board. Every POW that I ever ran into felt guilty, and some guys even considered suicide because they felt like they could never live with the guilt of having given up. And it was quite a revelation to me when I finally made contact with another prisoner and confessed to this guy. I remember my first contact, and I said, I need to confess something to you, and when I tell you what I've done, you may not want to communicate with me. You may hate me, and if our roles were reversed, I would probably hate you if you did what I did, because I assumed that I was the only one that ever gave in. Mm-hmm. And so he said, this is Bob Shoemaker, he said, what did you do, Plumb? I said, well, I broke. I tried to be strong, but I wasn't. I broke. And his response, and we're talking on the end of a wire. We're tugging on a wire to communicate with each other with this secret code that he had just taught me. He said, hell, everybody broke. He said, there's not a man in this camp that is as strong as he wanted to be. He said, so get over yourself, And that was a great revelation in my mind, to know that I wasn't the only one that had given in.
As you continue this, and again, you might have felt like you broke at this point, but there's still some unbelievable spirit that you show. And I'm going back to the book. Around the courtyard in a nearby room, my co-pilot Gary Anderson was undergoing about the same treatment. As soon as I heard him exploding obscenities, I knew he was near. Hey, Gary, you all right? I called. The guards were immediately on top, kicking and striking. Gary heard me and yelled back. It was 4 years later that I came across a POW who had been in a cell close to ours at the time. He said, boy, that was one of the craziest things I ever heard. You yelling, hey, Gary, are you all right? Bang, crunch, thud. Fine, how about you? Smack, crash, crack. Yeah. You eventually they're going to take you and kind of parade you in front of Vietnamese people. And Going back to the book, the officer briefed me once more. I was to walk with my head down until he gave me the command, let people see face. The guards removed the cuffs and I pumped my hands and twitched my shoulders to restore circulation. The guards carefully directed me to the door, removing the blindfold, and warned me not to look around. They then prodded me down the hallway lined with photographers and journalists, a group composed of Orientals and a few Caucasians. With the officer at my side, I walked out of the building onto the patio where a battery of motion cameras started whirring. The officer shouted to me, let people see face. Slowly and deliberately, I looked up, staring blankly into space, bowed deeply to the cameras, and lowered my head. I was uneasy about this entire charade, feeling a combination of resentment and embarrassment at being featured as a sideshow attraction. And
what I didn't know at the time was it was Ho Chi Minh's birthday. And so that was part of the celebration, was I was being presented to the president of their country as a birthday gift, popping out of a cake. And the good news was that I was in the media, that they were taking pictures of me. And so after a few months, my family saw those pictures.
right.
And so that was the good news about being shot down on the 19th of May.
So that was the first indication that people knew that you were actually okay.
Right.
Or you were alive. Maybe not okay. That's a strong word. Didn't mean to say okay. You were alive.
The picture that was taken and transferred to my family has me with my eyes closed, and my face was pretty well swollen. Mm-hmm. And my little brother thought that I was dead. He thought that was a picture of a dead man. And so, but I think most people, thought, yeah, no, he's alive. So,
you actually how'd you get stabbed? Bayoneted. So you were about to fall or something?
Actually, I was being prodded to walk faster by these guys, and I was hurting at the time. I was injured from the ejection, and I wasn't able to walk very fast. And I was blindfolded as well, and so I hit a rut in the road, and these guards with their bayonet fixed behind me stabbed me in the thigh. And so that was the worst wound that I had, and it festered for months because I had no medical care. But I never really knew if it was intentional or if it was accidental. But that was how I got that wound.
Now you get back in, and they give you the rules for the first time that you're supposed to follow, and the guy reads them to you, and I got to read these rules because I think they give a good indication as to what you were facing. Here we go. Back to the book. You are the blackest criminal that this country has ever seen. But due to the lenient, humane policy of the Vietnamese people, if you follow regulations, you live in peace. Regulation number 1, criminals must give full and complete answers to questions asked by Vietnamese guard or officer. Number 2, criminals must make no noise in room. Number 3, criminals must keep room clean and neat and must not mark rooms so graciously given by Vietnamese people. Number 4, criminals must get up and go to bed at sound of gong. Number 5, criminals must get under bed when imperialist aggressor bomb and strafe our sovereign country. Number 6, criminals must say bao cow when they want ask anything. Number 7, criminals must go only in area that guard orders when they go outside of room. Number 8, criminals must bow to every Vietnamese, guards, officers, and people. Number 9, criminals must not bring anything into room from outside. Number 10, criminals must not communicate with or look at other criminals in any other room or outside. With minor variations, these were the rules for the next 6 years. Big one was the communication. They didn't want you guys talking to each other.
No, they didn't. And they did all that they possibly could do to keep us from communicating. But we got very clever, and we had a lot of ways to communicate.
Now, you spent some time in solitary confinement, and here we go, back to the book. During this period of solitary confinement, I had much time to think. From the start, I established a definite schedule for personal reflection and appraisal. This included a 2-hour worship service in the morning and a similar one in the evening. I spent much time praying, talking informally with God, and recalling as many scriptures, verses, and Bible stories as I could. I also revived the words and tunes to songs from a Tennessee Ernie Ford album that I'd enjoyed on the Kitty Hawk. Once in a while, I would start humming too loudly, and a guard would bang his rifle against the door. I spent more and more time thinking about intangibles, the purpose for living, ethics, the supernatural, faith, pride, because the tangibles which I had identified with were no longer present. My aircraft, my ship, my personal possessions. This was the onset of a thorough re-examination of my life. Often these intricate thought processes ended in slumber.
One of the interesting things that are really most difficult to understand is how we had nothing going on. The average American has hundreds of thousands of inputs every day, colors and sounds and smells and touch and all these things. And when you're in a little prison cell, especially if you're in solitary confinement, you might hear a bird, and that's delightful. That's a big deal, to hear a bird and nothing else. So, again, the good news and the bad news is your mind goes internal. And you have to create things on your own, and so you think about these intangible things, and you go back through your life, and you think about the things that sustain life and why we are here, because there's nothing else to do.
Did you put some kind of structure around your thoughts? It seems like people might have a tendency just to let their mind wander, and maybe it wanders into places they don't want it to wander into.
No, there was a lot of structure to it. And in fact, one of the things I did was to go back through my life to the very first memory that I ever had at 3 years old in Lecompton, Kansas, when my grandmother came through and wanted everybody to go with her. Well, and I remember that date. And then I went from that to the day that I was shot down, and tried to remember every book I'd ever read, every friend I'd ever met, every girl I'd ever dated, every teacher, books, movies, experiences. And it took me about, as I recall, maybe 3 months working pretty hard on that that total autobiography in my mind. And after that, then I would continue to go back through those individual days and try to remember something else, a different color that I'd forgotten, or a different person that was in the room. And whenever I would discover something that I hadn't discovered the first 3 months, it was like meeting an old friend. I could think about that one person or that one book or whatever, for an entire day. And so it was a way of using that time and making the time go by working our minds.
Did you somehow catalog the days in your mind?
Oh yeah. It was a chronology. It was and most everybody did that, and a lot of guys did it much better than I. They could tell you, what was going on this day last year, the year before, and the year before. They could remember everything. Had it all packed away. But yes, it was very well categorized.
You finally get some pair of pants, couple pairs of pants, couple shirts, some underwear, undershirt, toothbrush, and some soap. And you are going to use it for the first time. I stripped and, with my little drinking cup, doused myself with water, lathered with my new bar of soap, and rinsed, shedding a 2-week layer of grime and sweat. Then I shaved using a double-edged razor, which had no handle. At last I was clean. No itchy beard, no reeking body. I put on my new clothes and wondered what impressions I would now make on the newly captured POWs. Dressed in fresh habiliment, I experienced a sublime physical and mental catharsis. Even the pain of my wounds seemed to wash away with the filth. 15 minutes later, I was back in my cell, re-inspired to outlast any Vietnamese endeavor to debase me. The door opened. I waited for something to happen, and then, in the doorway sauntered in a tall man, back hunched and forehead deeply lined. He studied me with uncertain eyes. An American. Another American. I rushed to the door as quickly as I could and grasped his hand, a hand which was completely numb from inadequate circulation at the elbows. "Hi," I said. "I'm Charlie Plumb." So now you're linked up with another American.
I am. Kay Russell was shot down the same day I was, and so he and I were. He was my first roommate, and you know, I was in the same cell with a lot of different guys, and they moved us around a lot. About every 6 months, they'd move us around, but they would give us different roommates every few months, or take them all away, and I was in solitary confinement again. And we never really knew why, but we assumed that it was try to destroy any fraternization with the guards and try to disrupt any unity within the prisoners. And so, in fact, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to describe exactly what it was like, because we were in different camps and different cells, and you were different guys for the entire 6 years.
But didn't you like it when you got a new roommate? Because it's like, and you kind of explained it's like now you have a bunch of stuff to talk about with this person.
Absolutely. It was glorious, you know, to find because, you know, he of course had all of the stories, and he had the movies that he could tell you about, and the things that he had learned, and that he could teach you. So yeah, no, it was wonderful. Now that would last for maybe a few months until you ran out of things, and then it became almost like a marriage, you know, where you've got those periods of time.
Honeymoon period's over.
Well, exactly. Well, the fact of the matter is, you couldn't, in some of those cells, you couldn't be more than 8 or 10 feet away from a guy 24/7 for months and months and months at a time.
Right.
And so little things start to bug you, you know.
Yeah.
And not the least of which was our toilet. You know, the toilet was a 2-gallon bucket in the corner, and lots of times it was rusted out at the top with no lid, and it was just quite a, you know, it stunk to high heaven in a lot of the cases, and it was quite an irritant.
Yeah, you guys established a routine once you got in there, and you know, there's a whole chapter in the book called Routine, and you're waking up at 6:30 in the morning, you're doing prayer at that time, you're at 7 o'clock, you're practicing piano, which I like, right? You're practicing piano, and
Yep.
that was just from memory. You had you ever played piano before?
I had not. Now, what I did know was that my span from my pinky to my thumb was not I could span 9 notes on a piano, and so I laid out a keyboard on my board bed, and I knew where the black keys were, and I had played in the band, and I also played guitar. So I knew a little bit about chords and scales and that kind of thing. And I thought, well, I've always wanted to play the piano. You know, now's my chance.
This piece of wood looks good to me.
Yes,
we'll make it happen.
yeah, this will work.
And then at 8 o'clock, you're doing push-ups.
Yep.
And sit-ups and leg lifts and whatever else. So you're doing some physical training, and then you have school. The school bell rings at 9:30 a.m. and you guys are learning and teaching each other whatever you can possibly teach each other. Whatever subject you were good at, you were going to teach.
We did. And it was serious stuff. As a matter of fact, when we got home, the University of Maryland gave us credit for what we had, you know, the courses we had taught, you know, without books or paper or PowerPoints or instructors or professors or anybody, because we were so intent on using that time for something of value.
Yeah.
And these guys, most of them smarter than I, would go back through their minds and recapture all of the subjects that they had learned. One of the guys, Joe Milligan, I was with him the first few months, I guess, and he taught a course on chemistry. No, biology. It was biology. And I'd never taken a course in biology, and I was very interested. And his course lasted about a week, and that's all he knew. But Joe, and I lived with him for a while, would lay back on his rack about an hour a day and just think about biology. And after being there for 6 years, his course lasted 6 months. And he knew everything from protozoas to metazoas and all of this, just because that was back there in his mind.
So he's able to recall that.
He could recall that.
If he dug deep enough.
And it is amazing, what's back in there in your human brain. And we found that out. If you think about something long enough and hard enough, and again, you don't have these distractions of everyday life, that there's an awful lot stored back in there.
Yeah. I had to bring this one up too, because you talked about how you didn't have PowerPoint or whatever, you didn't have pens and chalkboards, and here you go. Often in my dreams, I must admit, I envisioned leaving the Hanoi Hilton, going home, looking for and finding a brand new yellow pencil and bringing it back to my cell, or I would dream of entering shops containing nothing but rows and rows of pencils. I've never since taken a pencil for granted. That's we take so much for granted. I mean, we take so much for granted, and to think about that right there, and what power a pencil gives you: the power to take notes, the power to create, the power to draw, the power to write. This incredible power comes from this little thing that we just gaff off like it's meaningless.
That's right.
And for you to have that much appreciation for it, that you would dream about it at night.
True.
Yeah, it's incredible. 10 o'clock, you'd eat. And what was the food? You're just eating rice balls?
Yeah, mostly rice. That was the mainstay. You'd you get a small bowl of rice twice a day, once about 10 o'clock, once about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then you had a 20-hour stretch with nothing to eat. Sometimes they'd give you a bowl of broth, and sometimes there would be some kind of vegetable, turnips or weeds of some kind. One we call sewer soup. You couldn't identify this stuff. But I didn't eat, there was not enough meat to put in a coffee cup for a year. There really was no meat of any variety.
How much did you weigh when you got out?
I weighed about 140 when I came home, but they fattened us up before we came home. And I figure most of the time I was there about 115 pounds.
Did you did the hunger go away? Or were you just grinding hunger, or did you just get used to it?
It went away for the most part, after, 4 or 5 months. Your stomach sort of shrinks, and when you know that there's nothing else to eat, and so that they, in all fairness, they gave us enough to keep us alive, and so that and rice is a pretty perfect food. This is unpolished rice. It wasn't the Uncle Ben's that we have today, and there's a lot. There's protein in there, and there's nutrients in the rice. So that kept me alive.
Yeah. At dusk, you guys would have showtime, and people would do what you're talking about, describing everything, every movie they've ever seen, every book they've ever read, and all that. And you mentioned in here that in the beginning of confinement, the movies that would get described or created, because people were creating movies too, right, in their head.
Yes.
And they went from PG to XXX over time. So, did anybody come out and execute on some of these ideas that they had? Is there anybody that came out and said, "Yeah, I thought of this movie," or "I thought of this book"?
Oh yeah. In fact, several guys had great plans. One guy was a farmer, and he had planned a pig farm. That was his whole thing. And he did. He came back, and I lived with a guy by the name of Danny Glenn, who was an architectural student at the University of Oklahoma. And Dan and I were together for a lot of years. And he dreamed about building this home, and that's all he thought about was building this dream house. And he had several little things about this home that were very peculiar. One of them was as the sunlight would come through the top of the wall around our prison, the wall was capped with barbed wire and electrical wire and broken glass. The glass was from bottles that was various colors. And in one particular cell that Dan and I were in, the sun would come through the glass, the colored glass, and onto this tank of water, and then reflect up under the eaves of our thatched roof and into our cell. So we had all these colors, and it was a beautiful thing. It was a kaleidoscope of colors. And so he designed a house, and he figured this whole thing out, with the azimuth of the sun and all of this stuff and how he was going to do this. But and he would lay this out, and he would draw on the concrete floor with a piece of brick, and he was a great artist. The guy could design all this stuff, and of course, he wanted me to be involved in this and bore me to tears. And he's, Charlie, what color do you think my bathroom ought to be? I don't know, Dan. I don't know. No, Charlie, green or blue? I don't know. Green, Dan, green. Okay, so we get home in about a year after I was living in Kansas, and he was in Oklahoma, and he called me up. Charlie, I got something to show you. And so I had a little airplane at the time, and I flew down to Norman, Oklahoma. And he picked me up at the airport, and we drove outside of town. From about a quarter of a mile away, I saw this house that I recognized, but I'd never been in Norman, Oklahoma. And I swear I could have walked in that house and touched any faucet or any light switch, of the whole place, because it was exactly as he had designed the prison.
Unbelievable.
So I went to the bathroom, and it was blue. He had gone back. He had built it from building materials that he had remembered, and over the years that we were there, they changed, and so there were it was not available, and so he went to these old lumber yards, and he would find the building materials that he had planned this house with, and use those to build his house. But it was incredible. But yeah, a lot of the guys wanted to sail around the world. A lot of us Navy guys knew how to sail, and that was the big fantasy, was to take a sailing trip around the world. And 2 or 3 of the guys actually did that when they came home.
Awesome. The guards, some of the guards were pretty sadistic. And here we go back to probably the most sadistic practice of all was a game involving mice or puppies. Guards would douse them with gasoline, set them on fire, and turn them loose to squeal and scurry in search of relief from the heat. Then the soldiers would chase them with sticks, playing polo with their live fireballs until the little animals blackened and died. So you had some serious sadists that were just doing evil things. And you say you didn't see anything, book, magazine, newspaper, lyrics of song, written speech, any billboard, or anything while you were there that wasn't just 100% propaganda.
That's true. Their music doesn't talk about love, except for love of Ho Chi Minh and love of their country and dedication to that. It's really incredible how they just fill the minds of their people with this propaganda. And you tell somebody long enough and loud enough, and they believe it. And that's that was the whole country.
At one point, you got this propaganda newspaper, and it's the front page headline was that there's been a revolution in rice planting technique. And you were thinking to yourself, oh man, they must have invented some big machine that can plant all the rice, and now they don't have to be out there doing the manual labor in the fields. And here's the actual article. For 4,000 years, the Vietnamese people have been laboring, sweating, and toiling in the mud and water of rice paddies. We've discovered a revolutionary method of planting rice. Through extensive research, we have found that instead of grasping the rice sprouts and planting them with the palm of the hand facing downward, it is much more efficient to plant the rice sprouts with the palm of the hand facing upward. So there's the propaganda coming at you, and there's the advancement of the them trying to tell the people how we're moving forward in the world. And that was another thing that surprised me, or it didn't surprise me, but what their understanding, they're brainwashed, and their understanding of what American culture was like. And when you'd say, well, yeah, I have a car and I have an air conditioner, to them that was just unbelievable, because the only people that could afford that in Vietnam was the state itself.
True, and they assumed that if you had a car, you could carry pigs or chickens or something in your car, because that was the whole purpose of any kind of transportation, was to haul something around. And they were really surprised that you could actually just get in a car and go wherever you wanted to go.
And they also thought that a third of Americans were starving to death.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something to think about always when you deal with these countries where people are being indoctrinated and they're being fed information from the state. It's going to be lies, and you can't be surprised when they believe something like that. You just have to say, yeah, that's what they believe. How do we re-educate them?
I went back to Vietnam first time in 43 years. I hadn't been back, and a lot of things had changed. They still call themselves a communist country, but oh, by the way, capitalism is alive and well. But the propaganda still exists there, and I took my family with me, my wife and 3 of our 4 kids, and in the 11 days that I was there, I never met anyone. And I was at the embassy. I spoke to the students at the university. I spoke to cab drivers and waitresses and anybody, and they're really, really nice people and very, very nice to me. But nobody knew that Americans had been tortured in the Vietnam War. And in fact, it was just the opposite. They all would tell you that we got better treatment than the soldiers did, and better medical care than the soldiers did. And so, and in fact, in one of the last days I was there, I ran into a lady in a park selling postcards, and she was missing one leg, and she was about my age, and so I sort of pieced this thing together. And she said, "Want to buy a postcard?" Well, I'll buy a postcard, but I want to hear your story. Sit down on this park bench and then tell me your story. And she did. I said, "How'd you lose your leg?" She said, "Linebacker 2. Linebacker 2 was the code name for the B-52 bombings that ended the war in the Christmas of 1972. But it was a secret code name, and for her to say she didn't call it an air raid or a bomb or anything else. She just called it Linebacker 2. That was that was our pilot jargon, not her jargon. And I said, what was the date? She said 24 December, 1972. So I knew that she wasn't lying to me. She said, B-52. Oh, yeah. Well, so we talked for maybe 30 minutes on that park bench, and she spoke very good English. And at one point I said to her, "You speak excellent English. You could be an interpreter. You could be a guide. Why are you out here making a living selling postcards in a park?" She said, "Oh, my country would never give me a permit because I'm an invalid." Ah, man, what a country. And then I said, "Well, do you know about the museums?" "Oh, yeah, I know all about the museums and the Hanoi Hilton Museum." See, they've made a museum out of my old prison camp. The Hanoi Hilton is now a museum. And I said, "Well, how were the prisoners treated at the museum?" "Oh, they were treated great. They had great food. They played volleyball. They had ping pong." I said, "How do you know this?" She said, "Oh, documentaries. The government shows us documentaries." Yeah. And so she finally figured out that I was about her age, and she said, "Were you a pilot?" I said, "Yeah, I was a pilot." She said, B-52? I said, "No, I flew F-4 Phantoms." "Oh, so were you flying on the 24th of December of 1972? I said, "No, I was right here with you. I was in the Hanoi Hilton, and I was being tortured." She said, "No, that's impossible. That can't possibly be true." I could not convince this lady that I'd be, or anybody else.
Yeah.
So the propaganda is alive and well. They continue to tell their people the lies, and the folks have no way of figuring it out.
Yeah. It's another thing that you point out in the book on that culture or that system of government. Back to the book, the Vietnamese rarely exerted themselves. Why should they? If they were going to get a meal at all, they'd eat regardless of whether they worked for it or not. They didn't worry. They didn't have to. The state was responsible for their welfare as well as their guidance. Even the upkeep of state property was not their problem. So the scary thing when...
It really is. When folks are indoctrinated to that level. But it's so prevalent, and they tried to do the same thing with us.
Yeah.
They tried to brainwash us. And it was more important.
And you were kind of worried about that, too, in the beginning, right? Like you thought it was something you needed to be concerned about, and then you saw how ridiculous all this was.
Yeah. And, they used a lot of Russian military equipment, but they never invited the Russians in to try to brainwash us. And we felt very, very happy about that because their brainwashing techniques were so silly. And, they would tell us just unbelievable things that we laughed at.
But you thought the Russians would do a better job.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure they would have. But more important than the rice we ate or the water we drank, in every prison cell I was in, the first thing they put in there was a speaker. And, lots of the prison camps didn't have any electricity at all, but they had speakers. And they were put well above our reach, so we couldn't turn them off or adjust the volume. And several times a day, they would come on with propaganda and telling us, how bad we were and how terrible our country was and how wonderful they were, and it was pretty easy to turn these guys off, just to ignore the broadcast. But it was also very concerning, to see that that's the way they indoctrinate their own people.
Horrible. You talked about a little bit earlier. You talked about the communication and what that was all about. And you had this, the first time you were in your cell, you hear a little scraping, and eventually you go over and it's a little wire, and eventually a note comes through it. And here we go back to the book. It had a piece of toilet paper tied to it. I unfolded it and found these words: memorize code, eat note. The code was easier to memorize than the note was to eat, but I did both. I rechecked the door, sat back down on the honey bucket, and tugged on the wire. The code was a series of tugs which represented letters of the alphabet, and it's basically a 5x5 code: A, B, C, D, G, E, F, G, and that is how you guys communicated. And that had to be, how long does it take to have a conversation with that code? Because you give, 1, 2 tugs to go down, and then 1, 2, 3 tugs to go across. How long does it take? These conversations must have taken a long time.
Well, that's true, but that was the beauty of it, because that's all we had was time. And that was a very good way of whiling away the hours, is tugging on the wires or tapping on walls and or sneezing and wheezing. We had all kinds of ways to communicate, and we took great pride in our communication effort.
And the sneezing and wheezing, that just. Was it Morse? How did the sneezing and wheezing work? Coughing?
It was the same kind of thing. It was all based around this 5x5 matrix of the alphabet. Okay. And so a cough would be 1, a sneeze would be 2, a wheeze would be 3, and so forth. So that 2 sounds would equal a letter. Mm-hmm. And we use this in a lot of different ways. If a guy was outside chopping wood for a fire, for instance, and he would chop in this code: chop, 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 chop. And it was well, we called it a radio station because everybody could hear it. And so if a new guy came into the camp and and we knew who the president was. Because, we had no information at all, or knew who won the World Series, for instance. Why that was really big deal, to get out there and chop the wood in a radio station and tell the entire camp who was the president.
Did the guards ever catch on to that 5x5 code?
Yes, occasionally. A couple of guys were tortured to reveal the code, but they could. But they were. It was really interesting because they were so uncoordinated that they couldn't replicate the code. And on several cases, they tried to trick us, and they would empty out a cell, and they would go into that cell and try to tap on the wall or tug on the wire in the code, and we knew immediately, that it wasn't an American.
Yeah, and you guys would get, like I said, it's interesting. You laid out two things. That first, the Vietnamese were like pretty much okay with stealing, and so you wouldn't get punished for stealing that bad. But the communication thing is what they would definitely punish you for.
Yep, true.
Yeah, that. I mean, that's the same thing. I mean, when we capture prisoners overseas, we don't want them to talk to each other. We'd separate them, and you don't want them to talk to each other. And at some point, you started getting letters and receiving letters. And how did that change the environment?
Well, first of all, we were just overjoyed to see that our families, that my wife was okay, and that they knew that we were alive, and so it was a wonderful connection that we made. Now, we call them letters, but actually they were postcards, and they were highly edited. It began with the postcards were just blanked out, and then the Vietnamese decided, that's not good enough. They actually would cut out certain words. And so you get a postcard of 6 lines, and maybe of the 6 lines, there might be 15 words that were just cut out with a pair of scissors, so that sometimes you really couldn't figure it out what they were trying to say. But that the fact that that was in the handwriting of a loved one was very comforting.
And yet those bastards, and I use that term very specifically for this situation, the Dear John letters, they'd leave those completely good to go and turn those over.
Yeah, and
can I say bastards for that kind of behavior? Bastards.
Yeah, they were quick to tell us that our wives had filed for divorce, or that our parents had died, or that any bad news. They were very quick to promote.
Yeah. The chain of command that you guys, here you are in this prison camp, and you guys all, you figured out, you realize we need to have a chain of command, and you put that structure into place. And when you did that, it seems like it seems like that gave you guys so much strength as a group to get in the chain of command, to organize yourselves. It seemed like that gave you guys so much strength and fortitude as you were there.
It was absolutely our survival, was our chain of command. What you don't know in reading my book, because it only happened 2 or 3 years ago, a study was done of all the combatants of Vietnam, of all the 1.5 million people that were exposed to that war. 30.6% have PTSD. Almost a third of the combatants in Vietnam, post-traumatic stress disorder. Of the prisoners of war, 4% of us have PTSD. Wow. And it's primarily the guys who were shot down near the end of the war and were only prisoners for a few weeks or a month or two. And what we really believe, this is spelled out in another book called Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, which was written about 2 years ago. Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton explains that the reason why we came back and are in such great shape is because of the unity that we had and the leadership that we had in the prison camps. Because of the 591 guys came home, and of the 591, and they thought we'd be in baskets. They thought we'd be vegetables. They had our families briefed to institutionalize us for the rest of our lives. That's what they thought was coming home from the prison camp. I mean, what can you expect? From 591 guys, we've produced 17 generals, 7 admirals. Most of us retired as senior grade military officers. We have doctors and lawyers and preachers and teachers and bishops and judges. We have a bunch of congressmen, 2 United States senators, 2 ambassadors. We have a vice presidential candidate, a presidential candidate, my old flight instructor, John McCain. And they're telling us today we're healthier mentally and physically than if we hadn't been shot down. And it was primarily because of the leadership, the chain of command that we had over there, the unity that we found, and the purpose. That's what the leadership in the prison camp did for us. Jim Stockdale was our senior SRO, senior residing officer in the prison camp for a long time. And he said, we are no longer victims of circumstance beyond our control. We are not on the defensive here. We are military men, we are combatants, and we will pursue this war till our last breath. And so what that did was it gave us a reason to live, a reason to be, a reason to unify. And the way we fought the war from the prison camp was to try to deny them any propaganda. Because as you've already said, Jocko, that propaganda was the mainstay. I mean, that was numero uno in their world was propagandizing, and they felt that they could use us to tell the rest of the world how wonderful communism was and how terrible capitalism was and how they were right and we were wrong. And so they would force guys to make tapes or write letters to the anti-war element and proclaim the wonderful nature of communism. And so our job was to defend against this. And so we set up all kinds of methods so that we would deny them any propaganda. Or even in some cases, we would even go farther than to deny the propaganda. We would use their tools against them. And that we would tell the world that, oh, by the way, we are being tortured. And oh, by the way, these guys are attacking our neighbor in South Vietnam. And so that was the big effort. And like I said, this whole thing just came out a few years ago that this was the big reason that we did so well and that we're so healthy mentally and physically today was because we had this chain of command.
And on top of that, and this is what one of the big points I wanted to talk about today was what you're just hitting on, is that people have this idea that the military chain of command is this rigid structure, and that's why it survives. And but you guys were put into a position that it was, yes, there's a military chain of command, just like I had in the SEAL teams. And if you think in the SEAL teams that I was the guy that was in charge and I was barking the orders and everyone was following everything I said, it's like, no, it wasn't like that. It's a much more collaborative deal. And and this really became clear. One section of the book here, I'm gonna read that what you were dealing with and how challenging this leadership position was for the people that were leading. So here we're going back to the book. Making sure that everyone was on our team was the first of many objectives. Understanding the rules of the game was the second. It was assumed that all of us had a basic knowledge of the military discipline and the code of conduct. This code, a very general document, was open to many interpretations. How we construed the code often depended on the severity of the situation. No longer could we pick up a telephone and call the Pentagon for advice. The broad spectrum of the code divided the men into at least 2 groups. Those who were disciplinarians by nature and interpreted the code strictly, and those who were liberal and rendered the code loosely. We called these 2 groups the tough guys and the softies. But this is the key part right here. Softy was not derogatory. The name simply indicated a different approach to the code. Tough guys, who referred to the line, "I will never surrender of my own free will," sometimes flaunted their incorrigibility and taunted the guards. The Vietnamese answered with torture, and the tough guys occasionally relinquished more information than the softies who never committed themselves. Regardless of our attitudes, we were all in the same boat. Each of us had acquiesced to the Vietnamese control to some extent, whether accepting cigarettes or bowing to guards. The line which separated the tough guys from the softies was often unclear. The important thing was to display unity, regardless of our individual philosophies. We clearly understood that the Vietnamese would capitalize on any chinks they found in our armor. Unity didn't evolve automatically. Learning its value required from us such introspection and sacrifice. How could a camp SRO appease the softies? If he interpreted the code too strictly, or if he was too lax for the tough guys. He was in an untenable position, having little control over the actions of men in other rooms. He had excessive responsibility, but none of the tools of authority. No reduction of salary, suspension of liberty, court-martial. Indeed, most of the fellows he had never seen. His only association being a tap on the wall or a scribbled message. To meet this impractical setting, the SRO wielded gentle sticks of diplomacy. They knew we were not boots, meaning boot camp guys fresh out of boot camp who asked how high at the command to jump. We were all trained leaders who acted independently. For the first few years, the SRO's authority was limited to advice rather than orders. Realizing the importance of unity, we respected this advice as though it were an order. What if we refused an order on the basis that it did not come from the commander, but rather from 5 men who interpreted it through an error-ridden system? What if compliance to the order brought certain torture? We were very alone in answering these questions. Once I received an order, Plumb, request you communicate with Captain Abbott at all costs. What did the SRO mean by at all costs? Did it include being caught and put in leg irons for months at a time? So the way that is laid out, it reflects not just leadership in a prison camp. I'm here to tell you, it reflects leadership in every situation, because the minute that you as a leader decide that you're just going to impose your will on other people is where you start to lose respect and people start questioning what you're doing.
That's very true.
And I think that the way that this comes out, and that probably is one of the reasons why, I didn't know about the facts that you just told me about the only 4% having PTSD. I mean, and obviously you rattled off all the successful POWs that came out of this horrible situation. But that openness, that open mind as leaders and as subordinates to say, look, I'm getting this advice, right? Mm-hmm. This is so-called advice from the boss. I respect it. I'm going to act on it, not because I have to, but because I understand the mission. I understand why we're doing this. And therefore, it's not something that's being imposed on me. It's something that I am accepting and pushing forward of my own accord. Mm-hmm. That's a huge difference.
It truly is. But I must admit that when I first heard about this, I was taken aback, and I'm thinking, this is really silly. I've got some senior officer down in the end cell of the cell block, and he's putting more restrictions on me than I already have. I mean, what's he going to do? Take away my Liberty card?
Throw you in the brig?
Yeah, throw me in the brig. I'm there, and I had to be convinced, that this was in our best interest. But it truly was, and obviously that's the reason we came out as healthy as we did, was because you say it better than most. Discipline, a discipline brought about freedom, and it was kind of crazy because we were being restricted even more, and yet because of the restriction we had unity, which gave us the freedom.
Yeah, and then you guys started taking the broad code of conduct and specifying it, because you guys had so much time, into these things that you called plums.
Right. And
you didn't really know where the establishment of the word plums came from, but they were detailed tenets of how you all were going to carry yourself. And you called them plums, and they were things like the order that you were going to go home, not aiding the Vietnamese in whitewashing the truths, the resistance, what level of resistance you were going to give when you were interrogated, how much resistance you were going to give and Rescon 6 was just, military bearing, and then Rescon 1 was straight up hunger strike.
Mm-hmm. That was one of the greatest displays, I think, that really affected the enemy, was when they found out that when our commanding officer of a camp could say, okay, Rescon 3, no more bowing to the enemy. And so throughout the camp, in these individual cells, there might be 75 different cells, and suddenly, at the stroke of one button, nobody would bow to the guards, and it really frightened them to know that we had that much control, that much unity. And it was a silly thing, but it really felt so good, that we had some leverage here.
and the other thing was that how you stayed unified was by not accepting favors. And then you had to just, the dichotomy of leadership, right? You got to balance between, hey, if I can accept a favor and it's going to help us and it's going to make me healthier, then I should probably do it. But then they put this, then the commander, the SRO, would put a restriction or a reasonable time frame. So this was a classic example, because I already talked about how in love you were with pencils at this point. And at some point you got a pencil. Somehow they gave you a pencil. And the word spread that you guys had a pencil. And the report or the direction came back was, okay, you have 30 days to get more pencils, so we're all equal, or you got to give the pencil back.
Right.
And you didn't get any more pencils, and you had to give that pencil back.
Yep.
That's but that you can see how when you how unified you are, and how, just like you said, that shows the guards and the camp leaders, hey, we are unified, and you can't break us. You can't give somebody some special help and not give it to everyone.
Yep.
Unbelievable. Now, you started talking about this a little earlier, and I had to dig a little bit deeper on it because I think it hits a pertinent message, right? So when you talk about living with somebody, and how when you're living with somebody and the furthest you can get away from them is 8 feet, sometimes I feel like this with Echo, and we're, we don't even live with this guy, but sitting in this podcast thing and you start saying, okay, that's good. What things start to grind on you and irritate you. So whether they were exercise, you get a guy that's going to exercise while you're trying to sleep, or you get a guy that snores, which if you've ever dealt with somebody that snores, they can't help it. They don't even know that they sound like a chainsaw in your room. And you might get roomed up with somebody that snores every single night.
Right.
And the worst thing about somebody that snores is when you start thinking that it bothers you, it bothers you even more, right? The pacing was another thing that would, I'm just gonna get up and pace, and hey man, just sit down. So all these things, some POWs ate rice a grain at a time, and they got all these little, I guess these little idiosyncrasies, right? And what you eventually said was, I'm going to take those idiosyncrasies that bothers me about you, and I'm going to take the blame on myself. I shouldn't be bothered by this, and I'm the one that can't let it bother me. And that is a huge difference to what most people do, which is, hey, it's all about me, and if you're bothering me, you need to change.
Right.
And your all's attitude was, no, you know what? My attitude's, you don't need to change. I need to change. I need to become more accepting of the way you are. That's a big deal. If you can make that transition in your life, you can be a much happier person.
That's true. And I'm still trying.
We all are.
And it's one of those things where it really is a game changer, because now it's extreme ownership, right? I'm not going to blame everything on you for annoying me. I'm going to take it on myself. And then sometimes you'd have something that really, like, maybe you couldn't sleep, and now you got to talk to somebody else and have an indirect conversation instead of saying, hey, Echo's really bothering me clicking his pen over there. It's going to drive me crazy. Can you maybe talk to him about his pen etiquette and have him stop that? He's not doing it today, sir, but there was an episode where he had the pen in his hand. Things got a little bit fidgety.
Yeah.
And I didn't let it bother me. You know what I did?
Yeah.
brought him a new pen that didn't have the clicker on it. I took ownership of that situation.
You did. In today's world, we have so many people that are so offended by certain things, and it's the same principle there, is that if you offend me, that's really more my problem than it is your problem. It's I'm the one that decides if you offend me, and so I need to change my idea of what's offensive.
Yeah. One of the things that, where it's easy to sit and laugh here a little bit about some of this stuff, but one of your chapters is called Insanity. And I'm going to the book here. The first I knew of it was in the fall of 1968, and I didn't understand. An old beat-up French ambulance rattled into the courtyard, and an American wearing prison garb crawled out. He weaved like a robot with head down and shoulders slumped. It was odd. Guards never allowed POWs to walk that way. We double-timed. Who was this man? Had he just come from the hospital? Was he tortured into semi-consciousness, or was he faking? When would we find out? The man was hallucinatory, insisting that his cellmates were communists pieced together with limbs and heads of dead Americans. Whose arm is that, he asked. Is that my pilot's arm? How can you commies speak such good English? Because this man was wasting away, it was necessary for his cellmates to force feed him. The hostile patient was still strong, requiring 4 or 5 men to constrain him so that a bamboo stick could be forced between his teeth. Another prisoner mashed rice down his throat. When they finished, he would gag himself to regurgitate what he thought was poison from the communists, spewing rice all over the room. He was entranced. When the Vietnamese entered the room, he refused to bow. Angered, a guard screamed, "Bow, bow," and whipped his fist across the expressionless face. The man continued to stand. The guards continued to beat him unmercifully. And you guys continued to see this. Every 6 months or so, we saw our sick POW comrade transported between solitary confinement and the hospital. We felt helpless. The only way we could assist was with prayer. After September 1970, we never saw him again.
There's a little more to that story that I did not know when I wrote the book, that he had been a part of an experiment done by a Cuban. The Cuban came over to the communist country, and as near as we could tell, his sole purpose of being in Vietnam was to establish the breaking point of an American fighting man. And so this guy that I'm talking about in the book, and I didn't know his name at the time I wrote the book, Earl Cobiel, was actually tortured to insanity, and that is why he was insane, and so his roommates, and he was very belligerent, and I mean, here's another leadership principle, because you've got a group of guys in that prison cell that were being threatened, and some of them had broken bones or lacerations because of this crazy man. He goes on a hunger strike and is going to kill himself by not eating. And they had to decide whether or not they were going to force feed him and keep him alive and bring him back to his belligerence or let him die. And so it was quite a dilemma in the prison camp, and quite a dramatic time when that was happening. And they did. They force feed him and brought him back to health. And then the Vietnamese, for a reason we never really knew, but possibly because they saw that we had some control, and they didn't want us to have that control, they pulled him out of that cell, put him in solitary confinement, and then he died after that. But it was a tragic event that a guy would be tortured to the point of insanity.
And that was the purpose of the torture.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what you said. You said the purpose. The purpose was to find his breaking point.
Yeah, to find the breaking point, and they found it with Cobiel. Mm-hmm.
You have another chapter, and we touched on this a little bit earlier about faith. Going back to the book, "Thy will be done. Thy will be done." It seemed presumptuous to try to change God's will, to make a deal with the omnipotent. If I promised to devote my life to the ministry in exchange for freedom and failed to follow through, what then? No. Trying to bargain with God was unfitting. From the beginning, I offered prayers of acceptance. I remembered the experience of seeing the Christ-like shadow in the green knobby room and the comfort I felt in that time of great need. That day, I asked God for strength to endure whatever hardship I might face, and I prayed for Anne, not for her fidelity or success, but for tolerance, courage, and most of all, her happiness, with or without me. I continued this daily prayer. Now, faith was not just yours, but everyone. And here we go again, showing some of the power that you guys had as prisoners. Back to the book. Thousands of Bibles had been sent to us from church groups all over the world, but the Vietnamese gave us none. Asking wasn't enough, so we decided to go on a hunger strike. Our senior officer informed the Vietnamese that we simply didn't want more food until we could have a Bible and uninterrupted worship. They retaliated by shutting off our drinking water. After a few days, the Vietnamese were ready to settle, and so were we. They would give us a church service. If we abided by certain stipulations, the service would be held according to their schedule. No one could sing, no one could stand, and everyone would adhere strictly to camp regulations. Every word spoken in the ceremony was to be written down for the censor's perusal. After all the restrictions, we hadn't gained much, but at least the V had given an inch. After a few weeks later, the V saw that our services were not militant and relaxed restrictions. They permitted a 4-man choir to sing 2 hymns. Most important, they gave us a Bible for 2 days. So you guys decided to hold the line on that one.
We did, and it wasn't easy. An interesting thing, back to the leadership, was the guy who promoted this was a very staunch Christian guy. The number 2 in command was an atheist and really had no great interest in having a Bible in the cell. And so when the number 1 guy told the Vietnamese that we were going to go on a hunger strike, they hauled him out of there. They took him away so that the number 2 guy, the atheist, was suddenly in charge. And it was interesting to watch what was going to happen here. And it was very encouraging when the atheist said, continue the hunger strike. We're going to get this Bible.
That's awesome. You talk about their perception, the Vietnamese perception of religion in general. Back to the book. The large majority of Vietnamese were not Catholic, however, and when they discovered us in prayer, as they did only the last year, they asked, what you derive from this thing, God? We tried to explain that we received strength, comfort, help, and promise of eternal life. These concepts were too difficult for them, yet many seemed interested and did not mock our beliefs. To the die-hard Vietnamese communist, the state was their God, their truth, their way, their light. The controlling body in the government decreed infallible canons without fear of correction. Whenever peasants asked, who is the state? They were told that they themselves were, and that they had control in making decisions. Each was told that he was part of the omniscient state. He was, as long as he didn't interfere. I consider my confinement in prison to be spiritually beneficial. I was given an opportunity that few men have, the time to pause, to reflect, and to establish priorities. I found that my previous value system was unrealistic. Stripped of all my material wealth, the only beacon I could home in on was my faith in an unchanging God. And you also went very deep on thoughts around patriotism. And here's your talking about patriotism. Some POWs were super patriots, feeling the United States could do no wrong. A few felt that we had made a mistake and that it was time for us to get out. With most of the prisoners, I accepted the fact that we were not perfect, but felt that we were fighting for a worthy cause and should persevere into the end. And this is something I've brought up on many occasions, the fact of how hard when I fought in the war in Iraq, and we went through extreme measures to try and protect the civilian populace and the civilian infrastructure. And here's your comments on that. Back to the book. Great efforts were made to persevere the lives and property of civilians. Pilots were threatened with court-martial if they failed to pinpoint accurate military targets, even to the extent that they would jeopardize their own lives by swooping just above treetops to preserve a peasant hut 50 yards from a SAM radar scope. The Vietnamese, capitalizing on this, made targets especially difficult by placing their military equipment in the middle of peasant hamlets or next to schools. In fact, several anti-aircraft artillery guns were stationed on hospital rooftops. And your thoughts about the involvement here. The most powerful free nation in history could not idly watch the communist world gobble up and dissolve sovereign nations. We had to play the surgeon to excise the malignant disease of mind control. I don't condone war. I think there are few justifiable reasons for killing. In Vietnam, war was a last-ditch effort of international diplomacy. It was difficult to justify my 6 years of imprisonment when politicians with expense-paid trips to Paris should have solved the problems through negotiation. In this case, our negotiations were at the end of their rope. The communists didn't understand anything but the big hammer. When our B-52s shattered Hanoi's defenses with thousands of bombs, the Vietnamese realized we meant business. And this thought here, we faced east once a week and pledged our allegiance. We contrasted our Bill of Rights and the Constitution to the Communist Manifesto. Daily, we saw how Big Brother destroyed individuality. We compared our lot with that of the guards. While prisoners of war were behind bars, the Vietnamese were captives inside their own bamboo borders. We considered ourselves more fortunate than they. One day we would leave our cells. Powerful statement.
And that's exactly the way we thought, was that they were the prisoners and we weren't. We were always of the belief that we would go home, and they had to stay there. You know, they had to stay in their prison, and we would eventually be released.
And you were right. And during the week of 21 to 28 January 1973, for the first time, treatment was actually humane. The Vietnamese set up a volleyball net and allowed us to play or to exercise. They gave us books and magazines from home. We knew something was happening. So you guys started to sense that it was, and you talk about this in the book. I didn't go into it much, but there was always some people that were, what'd you call them? The people that would look at the amount of food you got.
Oh yes,
and they would read the amount of rice you'd be given as to some foreseeing the future of how long you're going to be in there. What'd you call them in the book?
We call them I forgot,
like fooditarians or something
exactly,
like that. No, gastronomers.
Gastronomers. That's right. That's what it was. Yeah.
Gastronomers. Yeah. Anyone that said, "Oh, they gave us more rice. We must be getting ready to be released." Right. And you hear that feeling. It sounds like, you know, once a year, once every 18 months.
Oh yeah.
Saying, "Oh yeah, here it is. We're out."
Oh yeah.
Almost done.
Well, of course, it depended on the person, but some of the guys were so optimistic, and I was an optimist. You know, I would think, you know, home. In fact, when I was first shot down, I thought we had finally given him the big blow. You know, we finally brought them to their knees on the 19th of May, And the first few days in prison, I thought, this is really going to be ironic because if the war is over and I fly home and my squadron has to take the ship home, I will be there to greet them when they come home. I mean,
that's a seriously positive attitude right there.
That is optimism.
Those poor guys have to ride the ship back. I'm going to be home before them. Oh, man. That's like I've said this before on the podcast. I always, when I'm in a commercial aircraft flying, I always think if this thing blows up in the sky, I'm going to live. I'm going to be that guy. Of course, I'm not going to get killed.
Sure.
Everyone else is going to die, not me. And so finally, here we go, back to the book. The camp commander once again called our group together, about 180 of us old-timers. It was the first time that all prisoners in the camp were gathered in one place. We lined up by buildings in military formation and were called to attention by our acting wing commander, Lieutenant Colonel Norm Gaddis. Although Vietnamese officials did not recognize our rank structure, they said nothing. The camp commander read an announcement, and the interpreter read the translation. It had been a long time since I'd heard English worded so professionally. When he finished and told us we could go, our wing commander again called us to attention and dismissed us. With heads bowed, we walked quietly back to our rooms. We were stunned. Some had waited for these words for over 8.5 years. The war was over. We were going home. Did that even feel real at that point? After you'd had your hopes up so many times?
It really didn't. And they'd tried to trick us many times. They would call us in, hey, sign this confession, we'll send you home. And so even when it happened for real, we couldn't believe it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really until we finally got aboard that C-141, and it took off, and the wheels in the well.
And when there was a little bit of a administrative situation when it came time, because you guys had all knew that you were going to follow the order that you were capped. The sick and injured were going to go first, then the enlisted guys were going to go, and then order of capture.
Exactly. And that was part of the Plumbs.
Right.
Okay, that was part of all of the rules that we were abiding by. And so we were numbered. Okay, the sick and injured guys went home, and then it was our turn, but by number of the date of shootdown. And they pulled 20 of us out that were out of order of the shootdown date. And we made a big deal of this. And they told us, well, Kissinger told us we almost caused an international incident because for whatever reason, and we really never knew for sure, except that all 20 of us had some disappointing feature to our return. And we never knew if that was the reason or not, but we were either coming back to deaths in the family or disease or divorce or that kind of thing, all 20 guys. And so, but we were out of order, and we did not know why we were out of order. And so we told them we weren't going home. And it went back and forth for almost a day that we refused to go home.
And then finally, Colonel Gaddis just pulled you in and said, listen, you guys are going home.
Yeah. He gave us the direct order.